All right, so let me start with introducing Aleia MacDaniel. Well, let me give you a little context first before we start with that. Let me give you a little context. This panel is taking place because I had seen Sinners. I've now seen it 3 times. I had been talking to people who had also seen it, many of whom seemed very confused about some of the things that they saw, not clear on some of the aspects of what Ryan Coogler was addressing, and particularly around the whole conversation of spirituality. And so I sort of talked to my son about the fact that, we really don't have a lot of information as Black people often on our historical connection to spiritualism in Africa, and that we needed to have a way to somehow clarify some of these things with people who have seen this film. So I'm in a screening with Harry and Linda, something totally different, but we were at the same screening, and I happened to mention this to them. And as is always the case with them, they're always ready to jump in and serve. And they were like, well, let's do a conversation. So that's what we're doing today. We're having a conversation around this idea of the way in which Ryan Coogler has used African spiritualism in this film. But we're going to start with Aleia MacDaniel, who is my lovely discovery. I love the fact that we've made our alignment together. She is the founder of the Dallas Hoodoo Society and has experiences as a teacher, a principal, an author, an ordained minister, and became a student of traditional African religion, and has led her to her practice of Hoodoo. So she is going to give us a context for what this religion is, so that we have no confusion about what we saw in that film as the filmmakers begin to talk about it. So Aleia, if you would take us into.
Hello, 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 everybody. I'm just going to ask for a thumbs up. Can you guys hear my sounds okay? So before I get it starting about what hoodoo is and what hoodoo isn't, I want to first give honor to the ancestors who have brought me here. There's nothing that I do and nothing that I know that is not on the shoulders of the people that came before me. So before I begin, I want to honor specifically Maxine and Roy Adger. I want to honor specifically the people of East Texas where I reside. I want to honor the people of California where I was raised. I want to honor the people of Louisiana where my family comes from, and from North Carolina where my family was trafficked from, and from West Africa where my family is trafficked from. Let's always begin knowing where we come from, because that always informs our context and our understanding of not just the past, but of the present. So thank y'all for joining me with that. And I would invite anyone that wants to give respect to their ancestors and for their legacy to go ahead and chime in the chat. And we're going to just get on started talking about what hoodoo is and what it isn't, so we can all come to this place as a collective and a common understanding. And if any of y'all have been in any Black church before, any Black community, we know that we do call and response. So this is not a lecture. I'm going to share some information, chime in the chat, give me your energy, and let's go ahead and do this, okay? I need to see some faces, something, make sure I'm not talking to myself. Okay. Let's start off talking about what hoodoo is. Because often when we have these conversations, we talk a lot around misconceptions, whispers, what we think it might be. So let's start off with some foundation. First, I want to start us off. The hoodoo is an ethno-religion. An ethno-religion are those things and ways of being and ways of believing that can be both part of our culture. So if you're Black, you practice hoodoo even if you don't realize you do. And it's also a religion as well. It's a distinct religion that does not have to be embedded in any other religious practices. And it's a sovereign religion all of its own. It's an African traditional or African diasporic religion, which means that our beliefs begin in West Africa, specifically in the Congo, Bantu Congo area. And it's part of the tradition of many things that are more popular or more known, such as Ifa or Santeria or Lukumi or Candomblé. And Hoodoo is just as much of a cousin as all of those traditional and diasporic religions. As I said, it's a sovereign belief system. It stands on its own. A lot of us have access through hoodoo, through cultural practices, through the Black church. And a lot of people don't realize that it's a belief system that also stands on its own. And we have our own set of spiritual beings, whether they are our ancestors, our community ancestors, and we also have forms of initiation. So whether, for example, like me, whether you've been through traditional initiations, or informal initiations, or initiations that are particular to your family or your religion, I'm sorry, your region, excuse me. But that is very much a part of hoodoo. So I always tell people I was initiated through Sisters of Tomorrow. I was also initiated in my grandmother's kitchen when I became of age and been invited into the circle of adult women. I have formal initiation as I got ready to move from high school and move to the East Coast. And there are some things that are key pillars in hoodoo. And these are very much shared with many of African traditional religions. We venerate our ancestors. Our ancestors are not just people who have come before us and who have died and who pass on their knowledge. They're people whose spirits are elevated. They're people whose spirits continue in us, and that there is a whole circle of life that we may get into later around how our ancestors continue to show up for us and provide for us, and the ways in which we still honor them. Hoodoo very much is intertwined and relies on nature, not just for the symbolism and not just for the things that we learn from it, but from the essence and the energy and the ways that we are interconnected in this world. Hoodoo relies on community. There's a reason why, especially among Black folks, when we say so-and-so is our play cousin or so-and-so is our auntie, whether they're blood or not, that those traditions come from somewhere. It wasn't just something that we do or just have adapted in this land, but it comes from our African roots. In hoodoo, I'm going to be clear with this because you see a lot of stuff on TikTok or social media or whatever, it's centered on liberation. So if your hoodoo is not about liberation, personal liberation, community liberation, political liberation, then what you're practicing isn't hoodoo. It utilizes a variety of modalities, everything from prayer to healing, to herb work, to root work, to dance, to storytelling. Hoodoo simply is about making shit happen with what you got. And so, like I said, a lot of times we hear a lot of things in through gossip and through a lot of different ways, and you may not realize that all these are all the ways that hoodoo is. And I also want to talk about what hoodoo isn't. And I might offend some folks in here, and that's okay, because the world isn't neat and pretty and cute, but I believe in bringing truth to power. A lot of times you hear hoodoo is a mix. If you Google something or if you see some of these books out here, they're from people that are not scholars or real practitioners. Hoodoo is folk magic based on white and native practices. That's not true. It's not true. It's not true. Hoodoo was and is and will continue to be a Black spiritual practice. It's not about demon and devil worship. It's not just about spells and hexes and doing magic and doing work against other people, even though that might be a part of it, but that's not what we call our work and why we practice our work. And it's not based on Abrahamic, Wiccan, New Age, pagan values and principles of morality and ethics. And I say that especially as newcomers who are coming into this spiritual practice and think, well, I want to do this work, but I don't want to harm anybody. Or I want to do this work, but I don't, believe in what's right or what's wrong. And they have a confusion and they're trying to combine what hoodoo is to what maybe some other traditional beliefs are. Especially in this day and age of solo practitioners and people who don't have elders or don't have guides to teach them, that they may be infusing practices and ethics that one have never served us and they're truly not centered to what hoodoo is. And we see a lot of that in the film about this blur of lines about what's right and wrong. It's not based on a particular set of ethics or a Bible, for example, but instead it's based on what is real and what's true and what is necessary right now. Hoodoo is not what you learn from social media. And I say that as a person that comes to this work and interact and serve in a lot of digital spaces, that while that might give you a glimpse and a hint, but it's not what you learn from social media. Hoodoo isn't for white people. And I say that meaning that everyone has access to learn, but hoodoo is for particular a religious system that is based on the liberation of Black people whose ancestors have been enslaved. So I want to give you that taste of what hoodoo is and what hoodoo isn't. We can have further conversation. I teach classes about it, but I wanted us to start off with that as a framework. So when we're discussing what we see in symbolism and spiritualism in sinners, which is layered and complex and nuanced and overt and all of the beautiful magic in between, that we have a clear understanding of just what we're talking about when we say hoodoo is and isn't. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aleia, for putting that in context for us. So now what I'd like to do is to introduce the panelists for you. We're going to have first, Patrick Washington is, just full disclosure, my son, and he is going to be the moderator for this discussion. Patrick's the owner of the Dallas Weekly and Washington Media Company, and he studied film at Clark Atlanta University. He's a bona fide film nerd. So, you know, this is, we're going to be talking to a bunch of bona fide nerds. So there we go. And we have Yaki Smith, who is Associate Professor of Film at UT Austin. He's an award-winning filmmaker with his short film Katrina's Son and Dawn, both of which streamed on HBO. And one of my other sons by another woman, Terrance Nance, who is an award-winning filmmaker. You probably know about his film An Oversimplification of Her Beauty, which was very popular in the mid 2000s, and his HBO TV series Random Acts of Flyness, which was fantastic. And so those folks will be talking now about the film centers, and especially about the way in which we are to look at that film with all the various and sundry symbolisms that he used. So Patrick, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and I'm going to shut up.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for joining us, and thank the panel for being here. Since we did have I think a very thorough understanding of the context of hoodoo, I was going to start with some of that symbolism, but I actually like to start with the filmmakers now and speak to something Aleia talked about as a part of the spiritual practice, which is the storytelling. And as it was mentioned in the film, we are talking about West African griot tradition, which is sort of the basis for the whole, connection between these sort of, dark forces that draw us into this world that Ryan Coogler has made. So as Yaki and Terrance, can you speak a little bit about from your personal experiences as filmmakers and as just as, folks that are, in this world of, Black filmmakers or Black cultural experiences, the storytelling aspect specifically of this film, but as Black filmmakers, how you feel storytelling is perceived by Black audiences and through the words of Black filmmakers. And Yaki, I want to start with you because although it wasn't Hoodoo, the film that I remember watching of yours had Black spiritual practices through the Christian practice all throughout it. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you decided to tell that story. And then Terrance, I'll go to you with, of course, your amazing and surrealist ideas of how that works. But Yaki, could you start off with a little bit about just the way as a Black filmmaker through storytelling you want to sort of impart culture, heritage, and history?
Yeah, first, thank y'all for having me. It's an honor to be here to talk specifically about this film, but also just talk film in general. I think, first and foremost, as Black folks, right, we know that we come from a tradition of oral histories, right? I mean, in many ways, a lot of our history has been lost because in some ways we've lost the tradition of oral history, right? And if we do not continue that history, right, we will in some ways find ourselves in a place where we feel lost, where we are not connected to the past, where our children are not even connected to their families in a meaningful way. And we're seeing that again because of the loss of this practice. And for me, I think film is a way for me to sort of continue that oral history, right? A way to tell our stories in a way that they will remain relevant, that people can actually access them, that people can learn from them, and that people can find themselves in them. I think oftentimes in our culture, we can sometimes feel lost because, again, we don't know what we're grasping at, right? Because in some ways, we have been separated from our traditions. That's why I love when Aleia is talking about what hoodoo is. It's like it's a connection to something that in many ways we have lost, right? And as a Christian man, I can say that I'm a Christian man here. And for me, even in being a Christian man, I think oftentimes if we're not careful, that religion can separate us, right, from our culture and our practices. And I think it's important that as filmmakers, as artists of any kind, that we find ways to make sure that we remain connected, right? You spoke specifically about Wolf, my film, which is about a family that discovers their son has been molested by their pastor. And I think in that film, it's interesting because one of the things that I was attempting to do was one, exhume this story that I think a lot of times we are not comfortable telling, right? This notion that that type of abuse is prevalent, right? That it is happening, that it is something that in order for us to actually overcome, that we must talk about it, that we must put ourselves in those uncomfortable spaces, that we must not be afraid to confront it. And I think, again, as storytellers, that's what we do, right? We put stories on screen that one, allow us to see ourselves, but also that allow us to confront ourselves and confront the many things that I think have been used as weapons against us. As we know, as Black filmmakers, for most of this sort of filmmaking practice, right, our stories were not told by us, right? There were other people who were taking our stories in their hands and they were putting representations of us or images of us on screen that in many ways were being used to oppress us, right? And I think for us, it's important that we rewrite those images, that we rewrite those stories, and that we use this medium as a way to take back our narratives and to finally put our stories on screen in the ways in which we should be telling them from our point of view and not from somebody else's point of view. Um, I could go on and on and on, but I want Terrance to jump in and then we can kind of get specifically into centers. But Terrance, you hop in and talk about your own practice too, man.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be invited to the conversation by my elders here, and obviously, yeah, he was you were one of my first film mentors ever. You know what I mean? Back when I was first starting out, so it's like super, super amazing to be invited. Um, yeah, I think just the capacity of art in general, but especially cinema, to reconnect us as Black folks with our culture, which I'm always reminded is the things we do amongst each other. You know, it isn't always. I saw something that culture is not like the thing, the song you hear or the movie you see. It's the practices and behaviors that were observed to create that thing. And I think I'm always reminded that kind of in the process of decolonizing ourselves from you know white European Eurocentric modes of being in our consciousness, we need to see people embodying, just the elastic, ecstatic experience of us being ourselves. You know what I mean? And it's cinema is uniquely, I think, you know, it has a capacity to do that in such a way when Black filmmakers, I think we use it, it's very kind of rooted in sound and in music. And like I don't know when somebody says this, the spirit, a lot of ritual practice always starts with sound, with music. Um, and I think that there's a real kind of emerging pedagogy on how, we as Black filmmakers can embody, our way of being, our culture, in cinema in such a way that makes it feel like, ritual practice. Um, and I think that my own explorations are really in that question, how to converge ritual practice and cinema practice. Uh, so yeah, it's definitely on display. I think that pursuit is not just me, obviously, as like you said, it's all of us in our own ways. Definitely Ryan, I think, is within that question. Not only in Sinners, but in everything he's been making in a certain way, but definitely Black Panther and Sinners have echoes of that pursuit. You know what I mean? How to reconnect the ritual practices that are just in our blood and in our just way of being with each other, and how to decolonize through re-embracing those practices.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to bring it a little bit back to the specificity of hoodoo. So, There's a line in the film Delroy Lindo's character Delta Slim says, which says, "This ain't this ain't what they imposed on us like that religion. This we brought with us." And he's speaking in that position about blues, but I wanted to talk about, especially what you two just spoke about, the connectivity between storytelling and Black music. Because I feel like Ryan Coogler did a wonderful film of sort of layering, I mean, a wonderful way of layering this idea of the griot, the storyteller, the music, and how Black music, specifically with the blues, has been a through line through not only our culture and entertainment, but our spiritual practice. They say this thing heals us. So, Aleia, could you talk a little bit about what you saw from a Hoodoo perspective, from a Black spiritual perspective, of how Ryan Coogler layered this imagery kind of throughout the film? Because what I've noticed in the film, I've seen it several times as well, he doesn't try to explain to the audience what hoodoo is, what voodoo is, but they do mention both and they show practices from both. From a hoodoo initiated perspective, is this an issue for you, like as far as the separation of spiritual practices, or was this just another sort of layered sort of how we are as Black folk? They don't do it the same as in Mississippi, as they do it in East Texas, as they do it in Louisiana, as they do it in South Carolina, etc. Could you speak a little bit about what you saw from sort of a building of spiritual symbolism in this film?
I would love to, and you're gonna have to cut me at some point because I can
You
talk
got, you
about
got,
this
you got
forever.
5 minutes. All right.
Okay, I'm gonna be less than 5 minutes. I'm gonna try real hard. Yaki brought up a really beautiful point about this idea of storytelling and what's said overtly and how our stories are lost. What I would add to that is the lack of obviousness and overt is part of it's intentional on two reasons. We know that when we were trafficked here, we were trafficked in groups that were not of the same language intentionally. And it was done so that tribes people cannot communicate with each other. But what we did always have, as Terrance said, is sound. So it's a reason why when Black people can get in a room and we have that look and we say, we know what that means without having to use words, right? And Ryan Coogler does a beautiful job of saying what he means in ways that we don't have to use words. It speaks to Black people through our hearts and through our spirits and in ways that we understand. In the same way that the Black in Black church is by virtue of hoodoo. What is Black in the Black church is because Black folks bought us to it. And we don't have to have the words. And not only was that intentionally done to us, but we brought it out in ways that we can go in and out of communicating with each other, just like the drum. The drum might sound like a surface beat, but it really means so much more. And so in that scene, and we all know what we talk about when I'm talking about that scene, right? When all time blends and it blends through music, that actually, I believe, was an intentional move by Ryan Coogler, not just to tell the obvious story of how there is our spirit and our spirituality and our symbolism transcends times, and that there's a through line, but it's not just the through line. In a lot of African traditional religions, we have this image of a dekanga. So I want you to visualize with me, and I can pull it up in a moment, but of a circle. And the circle goes counterclockwise, and it starts from birth. And then the spirit moves into adulthood, and then it transitions into what we call death. But it doesn't end there. Life continues into the spirit realm, and then that spirit reemerges again at birth. So you have this constant movement of a circle. And when you actually see the image of the dekanga or the Bantu cosmogram, it starts off with the cross. The cross is the center of many religions, and it's not by accident because it's about transcending planes. And so we get to see not only that dekanga and that movement and that transversing of lines and continuum of life and continuum of time all throughout the movie, specifically in that scene where all time collapses. But we also see this idea of music and as the drum as a vehicle to do that. And then I want you to notice and draw back to when you see that scene of the vampires outside of the juke joint and they're in the ring shout. A ring shout is exactly what you see when you go to any Southern Black church and people get to shouting. It's not by accident that we go in a counterclockwise because we're following the dekanga. We're always following the cosmogram. We're always following the motion of life. And that music is also a way that ties us. I want to give you just one little piece of history because if y'all don't know anything else, I'm a nerd in case you haven't figured this out. I'm a study, read, and I always like to inform people so that you can go back and learn and study on your own. Before we had praise houses back there in the woods, we had juke joints. And juke comes from a West African term for spirit. And so we had juke joints because we've always believed that music, possession, dance, and all of the things that go along with it was always part of spirit and part of the mundane life, part of celebration, part of the way that we party, part of the way that we move, part of the way that we dance, and part of the way that we twerk, part of the way that we worship. All of that is intertwined. And I think it's intentional on Coogler's part around why we had this story at this time take place in a juke joint and why we see the convergence of the music and we see the imagery and we see also not only did we see it in the juke joint, but the story begins in a praise house. And I think he's intentionally showing that there's no separation, just like in Hoodoo, there's no separation between the spiritual and the mundane. There were always all of those things at the same time.
From a technical standpoint, I want to split this into cinematography because there was a lot of conversation about the beautiful cinematography, especially on Black folk in this film, which we all, Ryan Coogler's a Black filmmaker, he makes that sure, but that has been an issue within mainstream filmmaking. So I want to talk to Terrance actually about this one because with your work, you have a lot of creative imagery to display these ideas. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the cinematography of Sinners, especially when it came to presenting some of the spiritual aspects of the film.
For sure. I mean, I think it's like that's the most underdeveloped part of the medium of cinema, which is how to visualize the unseen. I think part of just Black way of being in the world, Black consciousness, is that the unseen is taken as a matter of fact. You don't have to like prove it's there. You know what I mean? And in a movie, like you're contending with the audience's expectation that, it's a visual medium, and you're going to be shown, what the thing is you need to pay attention to. So unlike music, you're kind of like trying to play the game with a hand behind your back in a certain way, kind of fighting the nature of the medium. For a film like Sinners, the plot is about the unseen. It's like, it's about, the ego, the ancestors that are present, the extent to which they can protect or, provide this sort of like assurance that death is not the end. And I would say there's a lot of ways to talk about it. One thing that I saw on my second watch of the movie that I thought was like really, really worth pulling out is in the scene where I believe Stack is attempted to turn Smoke. He goes to bite his neck, and to get super technical about it, there is a visual effect that Ryan used to kind of show a kind of distortion in the air that is resisting Stack's attempt to bite Smoke. And it's one shot long. You know what I mean? It's maybe a second long in the movie. And essentially it's just trying to show you that like Stack tries to convert Smoke. It's not because he's a better fighter or anything like that he was unable to. It's because of some unseen force that is repelling his fangs, And, earlier you see that he's got the medicine bag that Annie gave him. Annie's her name, right?
Yes.
Around his neck. And then 2 or 3 scenes later, you see him pull it off before he's killed. Right. So it's pretty clear that he's using that visual effect to show that the thing is actually protecting him from being turned, which the film really clearly phrases as being turned as a state of disconnection from your ancestors. That's what it means, right? In the world of the film. But the thing that's keeping him from being turned is this energy, that's coming from the medicine bag around his neck. And I think that's like it's challenging because most times I talk to people, I haven't gotten too deep with many people about it, but most people don't notice that it happens. You know, most people don't even see it because he's trying to visualize the unseen. He's trying to show you something that maybe you should know technically or know energetically. He's under protection. The whole movie is trying to tell you smoke is under protection. Smoke is being protected. There's a circle around smoke. You know what I mean? But right in the moment when that protection has to be active, you can't show it. He doesn't have like some Agun come down out of the sky and stack up. He doesn't, because he's trying to show how it really is for us. He's not trying to make a science fiction film, where it's like an alien force. He's just trying to say this is how it works. And you can't see it when you're protected. It's just like shit that could happen don't happen. You know what I mean? And I feel like it's a really good thing because it shows you it's perfect. It's not a perfect solution in the movie, but you can see him trying. You know what I mean? You can see him doing a thing that maybe only a few people will notice on the third watch. You know what I mean? Because of the nature of it. So, yeah, I think that's in the movie, particularly a visual way that this kind of problem is being illustrated or elucidated.
That's beautiful. Yaki, a little bit off of that from the Hoodoo perspective, when you mentioned that, your film dealt with, Christian heritage, this film also begins in the church, as Aleia says. Could you speak a little bit about, just from your filmmaking experience and just being a Black Christian in America, do you find that films like this that sort of center uh, African Black spirituality as opposed to, and really in this film kind of almost say, don't go towards this, European influenced religion. Do you feel like the symbolism and imagery around Christianity and Hoodoo is powerful and should be explored through filmmaking, through, spiritual talks, through storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I think, it's interesting because I think one of the main reasons why you have this idea that we need to stay away from, or that is, like you say, devil worship, or that is something that is evil, is because we are ill-informed, right? We are not connected at all, which is by design, right? Right. When you think about the way Christianity is in many ways introduced to Black folks, right? When they come to America, right? It's introduced to us as a form of control, right? It's introduced as a practice to make us docile and in many ways to disconnect us from our sort of ancient traditional spiritual practices, which in some ways connects us or disconnects us, sorry, from our power, right? And I think for me, one of the things that's important is that we don't get into these conversations where we say, well, if you are Christian or if you are this, or if you are that, this is wrong or that's right, because I think they're all interconnected and intertwined, actually. Because in many ways, even when you think about the way we as Black people worship God in our church, is very, very different from the way you're going to see it in a white church, right? We're getting filled with the Holy Ghost, which means in some ways we are connecting ourselves to a spirit, as Terrance just said, that is unseen, right? And we are connecting ourselves to that spirit because we know that even though we may not be able to see it, we feel it and it has power, right? And it is the thing that protects us. We always say, my spirit told me not to turn left. My spirit told me not to turn right. My spirit told me not to eat there or do that. And in many ways, that is God, right? Those are the ancestors speaking through us and in many ways warding off some of that evil, even if we do not call it that. And that's okay if you don't call it that, but that's what's happening, right? Even in the ways in which we dance and we sing, right? You spoke about the drum, right? All of those things come from Africa, and we brought those things with us, and we found a way, because it was forced upon us, to take our African spiritual practices and in many ways merge them with this Christianity that we have. And it doesn't mean that one is wrong or one is right, but it is the connection and the sort of dance between the two that keeps us protected, that keeps us holy, that keeps us, again, yeah, just connected to who we are as people. And I think there needs to be more discussion about what those practices are, right? What are those African traditional spiritual practices and how are they connected, right? And I don't think we do enough of that homework because, again, we've been told that's evil, stay away from it, again, which is all by design.
Ali, I have a
I was gonna just add on real quick too, just so I'll just make a point for people. I just want to just point out we had the twins' father, who was he's
Brother.
never seen. We just know he's the gifter of the guitar, and we have the pastor, which is I've lost his name for a second.
Samuel.
Um, his father, they're brothers. Did we pay attention to the fact that you had the pastor and the blues man were brothers? And I think that that's also intentional.
I think all of it was intentional. And since we're talking about intention, I want to talk about from a hoodoo perspective. Hoodoo is a closed practice. So as we learn about in our own practices what it is, and let's say we even get initiated as, and then we got filmmakers. What is the line of displaying hoodoo practices while knowing it is a closed practice? This is not necessarily, in my opinion, this wasn't a hoodoo film, but it or a voodoo film. It wasn't like that, but it had its elements. Very, and I would say front-facing elements. Mojo bag, haint. They mentioned haint twice, but didn't explain what that was, but just mentioned it. But what is the sort of, in your opinion, the line of, okay, this is what we do, but this is where the circle closes. And we cannot be saying to the world, here's how this works. Do you find that there's going to, there should be a line like that within Black film and also, in this film? What did you think of the sort of keeping of the closed circle, if you will?
I think that's an excellent question. I think both and. It's a closed practice, which means simply you got to be Black to be hoodoo. And our initiation happens in a variety of forms that are not public facing on always. I think about it like this. We can't help but show who we are and be who we be public facing. And there's a lot of reasons why we've had to hide and be very secretive for our own protection. More than anything, it's always been for our own protection. And there's a lot of ways that we do some of these things out loud that other people don't even realize what's happening. So we see, for example, and I'm forgive me, I've only seen the movie 3 times, and I'm confusing characters, but we see the mojo bag is still present, but it's right underneath his shirt that he wears on him. And so if anybody knows me, you don't even know what I already have on my body. It might be right out loud, but you'll never see it. So I think in this reclamation of hoodoo in African traditional religions, there's always going to be a part of it that is public viewing simply because of who we are and the ways that we move in this world. But there's always this part of gatekeeping, which I strongly believe in, that's private. It's the same way that you can take your auntie's sweet potato pie to the cookout or to the family, to the work potluck, but you're not going to ever give away the recipe unless you know. So we might show and visually display certain things, but we're never giving away the recipe and the why and the how. And even when people think that they can get it, because you can Google anything nowadays, you'll never know what's right and what's wrong. You'll never have the ashe. You'll never have the spirit of us putting those things together and knowing that what's the temperature of the house have to be when you make that pie, when you pinch that crust, knowing when you bring the eggs out the refrigerator, because those are only the things that you're going to know when you're sitting at the feet of somebody. You're never going to know all of the pieces by reading in a book. So we do our due diligence about keeping what's sacred, sacred. Also knowing that there's in this world, you have people that can Google just about anything, even though a lot of that's wrong or has been stolen. And then also it's never going to be complete because I don't know about you, but when I give away how I do my greens, I'm going to give you the pieces of it, but I'm never going to tell you all of it. I'm never going to tell you at what point do you add in this piece, and if you're doing vegetarian, what you're supposed to do, and the why and the how. And what happens though is that we get to gatekeep, but also that can be dangerous in a way, because even when you have other folks who might be trying to replicate something, and I'm even talking about Black folks, white folks, whomever, they might be doing pieces of it and don't understand what and why and how what they're doing, and they end up messing it up, messing themselves up, or they don't understand what they're getting themselves into. So that's why I always, I'm going to talk about it forever. And I also put some magic around what I do. So for example, I sell a Hoodoo Basics course, and I say specifically it's for Black folks. Now, can somebody else come and buy it? Sure. Are they going to get what they deserve? You know something is for you and if it's not for you. And it's also why I say that this work is always done in community, whether it's your family community, your regional community, your people, and you know who your people are. I also want to move the conversation away from, a lot of times we do worry about gatekeeping, and it's absolutely necessary and important. What I would also add to it is turning inward and thinking about, how do you use this practice for your liberation and for our community liberation? When we stop worrying about what other people thinking about, looking, seeing, viewing, and opinion, then we can do the work that's intended for us, and we ain't got to worry about who looking and who's doing what with it. We have our protocols and we have our ways, but let's turn the conversation to for us, by us, and for us.
Wonderful. We only give about 15 minutes for the main conversation, so I want to kind of open this as an open-ended question to the filmmakers and you too, Aleia. But I obviously I think a lot of Black folk understand the color white and this sort of thing, but I'd like to talk to y'all about color. Aleia, you'll speak from a Hoodoo perspective, but from the filmmakers, I'd like y'all to talk about a little bit about the use of color in this film. It was a horror film by technical genre, but there was a lot of what I like to call like Afrocentric coloring in this. And whoever would like to go first, filmmaking wise, please go. But I'd like to get your thoughts on like what you felt as far as the coloring of the film, and that can go into costuming and set design, even lighting, however you saw that, because what struck me most was obviously Ruth Carter did a great job with costuming, she always does. The red, blue, smokestack kind of situation was great. But when Annie she was presented as almost like a homely woman, but then as she transitioned, she wore these elaborate white things, which of course symbolizes spirituality. But I thought that might have been lost on people who don't know specifically African spiritual practices and might have just thought that as like, oh, she's in heaven now, when it really means more than that. But I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on how Ryan Coogler used color within the costumes, the setting, the lighting, and how you saw that to be an effective thing or, message giving thing. And from Aleia, your perspective, just how that might pertain to African spirituality and symbolism. So, Yaki or Terrance, if you'd like to jump in, go ahead.
Dr. Can you just say the last part she said about people might not have caught that Annie was a what? I didn't
So,
understand.
yeah,
Yeah.
in the final scenes, Annie is, when she is passed away and she's coming back to sort of get smoke, she's draped in this very elaborate white lace kind of thing, which of course through African spirituality is the spiritual world, all these things, we do that with our ancestors. But I thought people in the audience, the general audience, might have just sort of thought maybe they're just showing she's in heaven or something like that, when that had a little bit of a deeper meaning from the color white on Annie as she is on the other side. And I just wanted to get y'all's thoughts about just the use of color through, costuming, lighting, or sets, however you saw it, and how you thought that might have affected the film's, presence, effect, the audience, etc. And so whoever wants to start off with that,
I do
please.
I do want to say something about that scene as it pertains to the color white. In Ifa used to wear egun, obviously for ancestors, and a Baba who I'm close with. He said this thing to a group, which is like, you don't hear people talk about like when they're their grandparent or they're around somebody who's kind of moving towards their transition. You don't ever hear them talking about, oh, Oshun came to me or Yemaya came to me or anything like that. It's always, my grandmother came to me when she was young, or my mother, or my younger brother who died when it's always an egun. It's always an ancestor who is kind of like there to be the usher. You know what I mean? And I think that I'm sure has many across like different West African spiritual practices, has many synchronicities. And I thought how he rendered it was really super interesting in that moment, because on the second watch, I paid more attention to her dialogue. And obviously there's this theme of like grief, and often in definitely in Ifa, Yoruba, spiritual practice, the white as the color you wear during a grieving moment or interacting with the egun for breathing purposes moment is like active there. She says this thing, which I thought was connected to how grief is presented as this, way of getting in touch with your spirit even with Delroy's character, like when he's kind of grieving his friend in the car, this way of like letting out and purging the pain. She says this thing to him, which is like, you can come over here, but you have to I think she says you got to put the cigarette down.
Yeah, you got to put all that smoke away.
Because I don't want to put any smoke on him. And she refuses to call him Smoke. She keeps calling him Elijah. And I thought about that a lot because of this idea that, and you find how you have your Ori or your head. And this is like maybe encapsulated in your name, that comes through an initiation, right? And that name is very important. It carries a lot of meaning for your life, and what your Ori is here to do, or your destiny, right? And the fact that in this lifetime, the name that maybe ordered his destiny was Smoke, and that in going to this, Orun, or this ancestral realm, this other realm, he was going to have to put that down, and deal with this other name that was maybe always there, Elijah, which maybe has other symbolic meanings or intentions for what his destiny might be. I thought was really, when you're watching it the first time, it feels subtle, but the second time it's not subtle at all. Like she's very like, I don't want any smoke to get on him. It's very like, it's very intentional, and I really love that as an invocation of like just Black ontology, and just how we see reincarnation, and how we understand destiny, and how we understand destiny encapsulated in names, and how we understand naming, and what it might mean to pass something on intentionally or unintentionally, and how that's all like moving through the world of the ego, like as opposed to other entities which are symbolized with other colors, to your point of your initial question. So I thought that scene was really important. It's very short, but it ended up like coming through this symbol of smoke, and then the kind of the cigarette getting passed between the brothers was a constant moment, like, and also what tobacco means as a ceremonial plant in terms of communication with the ancestors, and the synchronicities and the collaborations that might have happened between the Choctaw and the different native people that they would have been interacting with. So it's like the layers just that were very, on the first watch, I didn't catch none of that. On the second watch, I was like, he kind of snapped, you know what I mean, in that whole situation.
Aleia, are there any thoughts you have when it comes pertaining to the colors and the imagery there, as it pertains to hoodoo and spirituality?
Absolutely. I want to first start off. Did we notice that the main three colors in this movie are red, white, and blue?
Yep.
I mean, if that's not a commentary in itself, that. I think about the color red. I think that Terrance did a beautiful job of explaining the symbolism of white, and why white is such an important spiritual color. There's a reason why in Black church, First Communion, First Sundays are all white. There's a reason why the motherboard isn't all white. There's a reason why we even have a motherboard. You don't have that in any other churches. That white is our connection to our ancestors, period and point blank. Is why some of us wear all white to funerals. That is how we show respect and homage in this continuity of life. But let's talk about the color red, because red is a color that belongs to many cultures and many spiritual belief systems, and is often misunderstood. There's a reason why we equate oftentimes red with demonic and badness. It's because in most religions and traditions, red is a color of power. It's a color of protection. And so when we think about the Haitian Revolution and the people who invoke Shango, and that they wrapped themselves in red, and they wrapped their swords in red before they went and took back their land. And that there's a reason why when those people then came, when the white folks fled Haiti and came to Louisiana, why red was an outlawed color. And then when we trace it even in Black culture, I don't know about y'all, but I grew up, you couldn't wear red fingernail polish before a certain age. And you definitely can't wear red lipstick and red nails to church because red is bad. That idea of red being bad actually comes from a place of disempowerment. So you layer that, but then there's another part of the layer that my daughter, my 16-year-old, taught me. And she said that red in Chinese culture, writing in red writing in particular, is bad luck. And do we remember when they're in the grocery store and I'm losing all the characters' name? And she said, all we have left to make that banner is red paint. And
Yeah.
she gives it to him at a discount because she knows what that red color is invoking and what potentially can come to it when you write banners and letters in red. But at the same time, when you see Chinese New Year's, things are given in red envelope because red is luck and prosperity. So this interplay of red and what it means, is it bad? Is it good? Is it somewhere in between? I think is really intentional and important. And because it opens us up to the questions, not the answers, but it opens us up to the questions. And the questions give space and give room for us to have these conversations. And I think that that is very intentional. And I think that that's also what's special about Black horror and Black sci-fi. I think the Black folks, we do it different. And I'm reminded of a word that actually I learned when I was doing Spanish literature about surrealism. Our magic is never seen as this thing outside. Magic and what's out there in the other worlds are always infused. So when Ryan Coogler is telling us this story, it doesn't feel like a horror movie with these random vampires. It's familiar to us. It's familiar to us through haints. It's familiar to us through color. It's familiar to us. It's something that is of a course. When we read Octavia Butler and we see what's her sci-fi of the future, and we realize it was nothing but truth to power and prophesying about what's now, we realize that that's always what's true about Black fiction and Black horror and Black sci-fi, is that it's calling to what Terrance said, it's calling from what's unseen to giving it word and giving it sound and giving it magic. And I think the same thing happens with the use of color in this as well too. It's asking the questions. And then the last part is about the blue. We see blue in Ifa, and we see blue in a lot of religions as this protection color. What it actually reminded me of, because it was a particular kind of blue he used. He used the blue of the indigo dyed people of the Gullah Geechee, who were in those indigo fields, whose skin were literally stained with blue as they were dyeing the clothes to have them being sent to the factories. That particular type of blue was intentional, that's what he had Annie in. And he had her in beads that were reminiscent of alekes, or spiritual beads that a lot of Ifa practitioners use as well too. So I think that not just the colors themselves, but the stories that those colors represent and the questions that those colors ask. What is it that Toni Morrison, I could be wrong, there are years that have questions, there are years that ask questions, and there are years that have answers. And I think that the color brings us out the questions.
Beautiful. Well, I know that we were spending a little time at the end for questions, and we are coming up on the end of the hour, so I'll switch back to our host and see, are we doing chat questions or?
We're supposed to have people putting questions in the chat, and I think Sydney was going to monitor that.
A lot of commentary. I don't know if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat right now. We'll be sure to.
I would like to, before you move on and ask questions from the audience, I'd like for you to have some discussion as Aleia said, the scene. I think we need to talk a bit about that scene where the dancing, the music, and all of that comes into play, for people to really kind of get a sense of the power of that scene.
Okay. There is a question that kind of pertains to it. If anyone wants to talk about the banjo and its connection to West Africa and African American heritage, there's a Paris Brown is asking about that Preacher Boy's guitar. I would like to do that before I get to yours, Mom, because there was something that is a beginning to end thing with the guitar. If you notice in the beginning, his preacher father takes his uncle's sinful guitar, and tells him he needs to, basically give up the life of blues and stuff. And by the time he comes back, the guitar is broken in his hand. He's telling him to give it up for the religion. And then we see him, of course, years later as a blues player. So I think that this guitar, in this particular one, outside of the banjo being from West Africa, was a symbolism of keeping your culture, even when outside forces, evil forces, are trying to rip it apart and give you reason to let it go. You never let it go. So I think that was just me. I'll let anybody else who wants to, address that, do that. But the montage scene of the, excuse me, blues. If anybody wants to talk about it, was obviously the anchor scene of the film, moving from 1930s Delta blues into West African drumming and dancing, into hip hop, ballet dancing, but he also had even other cultures, the Chinese community members, their ancestry in the dance, but he also expanded that into the Irish Danny Boy performance. I'm sorry, it wasn't Danny Boy. It was, I forget the name of the song, but the Irish folks song that came out. So this whole idea of collaboration, and when Remick says, I want your songs, I want your histories, if that will. I've heard people say that that's symbolic for everything from the music industry to assimilating into white culture to the cultural assimilations of other people. And I think that it was ambiguous and specific on purpose. I think that this is the type of filmmaker Ryan Coogler is kind of growing into, is this very layered, themed cultural filmmaker. But the idea that he even presented Chinese American characters in this as prominent members, the Choctaw, even though they were very brief, had a very important commentary on the film. You have the Irish immigrants that came over and really became sort of the arm of white supremacy out of their abuse from Europe. And there is no answer to who's the bad guy in this film, which I think is very, very good. Typically with films like this, it's like the white people. But as we hear, Remick, what he's doing to other people had been done to him by these Christians who came to his land and stripped him of his languages and his cultures. And by the time he is woken up, even the scriptures give him comfort that he's presenting it. So I think that there's a lot that particular scene imparts, and I think that it's a wonderfully ambiguous and it's a wonderfully broad, but at the same time beautifully specific. And I think that is the testament to the artist that created it. So I will open the floor up to the last of that. Terrance or Yaki or Aleia, however you want to answer Mom's question about that scene. But please.
I just want to add a couple of things that I think are important because since we're talking about the guitar, we see the beginning and the end of the guitar, but let's talk about the middle of the guitar and Remick having the guitar. It's not by accident that the instruments that are used by the Irish are the same instruments that were taken and adapted, appropriated, whatever word you want to use, by Irish culture. And I think that it's important to name that for a couple of reasons, because we see the banjo and we see the fiddle that they're using. And we also are reminded, as you mentioned, Patrick, about the Irish being the arms of whiteness at this time. And it's actually at this very interesting time in American history, because prior to the Reconstruction era, Irish has this very interesting interplay with Americanism that's at a crossroad of in and of itself. You have the Irish not just talking about what happened in England, happened in Europe, but also how they were used prior to Bacon's Rebellion and not seen as white. There's a wonderful book called How the Irish Became White, and how there was this specific moment in time when moneyed people realized that if Blacks, Natives, and Irish were to band forces, were outnumbered and out strategized. So we need to make the Irish white and not see their own oppression, and instead see the aspiration of what they could be if they were white. And so it's not by accident that we also see Remick using those same instruments as well, and also conducting the ring shout. And it says a lot around this interplay of Irish specifically. And then we see how Irish people, if you know anything about slavery, then the paddy wagons, the overseers, who then literally directly become NYPD and Boston Fire Department, that those traditions carry and that semblance of power carries. And we see, so I believe that this idea, this guitar and its placement in it asks those questions. And thank you for the commenter that reminded me that was Zora Neale Hurston's quote and not Toni Morrison. I think also in that scene, in addition to that, is asking the question not of right or wrong, as you say, but that there's always this constant of time and of which realm are we in. It's a reminder that all of what we do now comes from somewhere, and all that we will do is part of a continuum and part of a lineage. And this question about allyship, that's a loaded question and a loaded word for me. But it reminds us that we are in circles that have rich culture and tradition, but power dynamics and how they are used and weaponized against each of us. Someone in the comments asked this question around, there's not a lot of conversation around the particular history of Chinese in the Mississippi Delta. And that's a strong part of the culture. Even if you notice very small when you were in Annie's Hoodoo and Root Shop, there's writing on the wall, writing on the glass plane. And if you read it in reverse, she's selling yakamine. Yakamine is a particular dish from Louisiana that's infused with Chinese culture and Black culture that she brought over to the Mississippi Delta. So I think that scene is not only the obviousness of the transition and transcendence of time, but also the interplay of cultures and how we can use our power for each other, but also how instead what ends up happening, and we see this to this day, when people have a semblance of power, and I'm not talking about even racialized people, I'm talking about when people have a sense of power, instead of how do we combine is how do I take my piece of power, piece of privilege, and use that to wield control and dominance and oppression against other people. And we see that amongst races, we see that amongst genders, we see that amongst sexualities. And so again, it asks questions.
Okay.
Yeah, that scene, in particular, it made me immediately think about James Cone's book. I believe it's called The Blues and the Spirituals. I read it a while back, and he really talks about this notion that you cannot separate blues music from gospel music. You cannot separate blues music from spirituals because in many ways they are in conversation with each other, right? This notion that one is profane and one is holy, or one is something that we should see as evil and one is something that we should see as good, is actually disconnecting us from the power of that music to again conjure up, right, the past, present, and the future. And I think when I was watching that sequence, I immediately thought of this notion that Sammy, because he is already rooted in a spiritual practice, right? That he has the ability within him. It has just not been unlocked because his father wanted him to, in some ways, stop connecting with a certain part of it. I only want you to connect with this quote unquote good part of it, whatever that looks like. But I feel like this other part is profane when in fact it's not profane at all, right? But it is the power of both of those things together that will allow Sammy to become, again, the great griot, the great musician, the great conjurer of spirits that he actually becomes. And when I watched that scene, because I know there's all this debate about, oh, is Ryan saying that, organized religion is wrong or that Christianity is wrong? As I watch the film, I don't get that at all, to be honest with you. As a matter of fact, I think that they all have to be in conversation, that they all have to be um, happening at the same time, and that they all have to sort of be within us in order for us to actually be able to do the work that we have to do. I don't think we can cut ourselves off from one. Um, Also, when I think about that scene, it makes me also think about just even the notion that when he goes back to the church, right, and his father again says, I need you to drop down your evil ways and I need you to, leave that along and bring yourself back to God. And Sammy cannot do that because I think, because of the experience that he had in that juke joint, because of the experience that he had having to ward off that evil with Remick and the other vampires, he understands that again, that one cannot exist without the other, that his father is in many ways asking him not only to cut himself off from a piece of himself creatively, but his father unknowingly is asking him to cut himself off from a piece of himself spiritually. And it's an ascension that his father will never ever reach because his father has decided that that part is evil. When in fact, again, Sammy, because of this experience that he had to have, right, knows that all of these things must be in constant conversation with each other in order for him to be his best self and do his best work, which is why he becomes the great blues musician that he ultimately becomes. Because I don't think he ever left any of those things behind, which is why I believe that the very last scene of the film, right? If we think about the very last scene of the movie, where are we at? We're back in the church. And Sammy is actually playing this guitar in the church, right? And because again, I believe that he cannot be disconnected from it, even if in fact we want him to disconnect from it, he cannot because he knows that that's where his power lies. And it's interesting too, just thinking about, obviously that scene is really the scene that brings Remick, I hope I'm saying his name right, Remnick or Remick, whatever his name is, right? That brings him to the juke joint because he hears the power of it, right? Because again, as Sammy is in many ways conjuring up these ancestors and conjuring up these people that will come after him and conjuring up his contemporaries, right? And having this sort of conversation with all of them, Remick hears this, and because he's been cut off from his ancestry and from his history, he knows that, and as whiteness does, it understands that we do have a direct line to a spiritual other world that it does not have a direct line to. And so he wants that. He needs that because he feels cut off not only from his history, but he feels cut off from himself. And he knows that the only way for him to actually be reconnected with something real, something pure, something that he feels that can be transcended is he literally has to be a succubus and take this boy's black culture from him, right? It's cultural appropriation because he knows that he's void and dead on the inside, that he needs that to actually come alive.
I just want to just amplify something because I do your work. In that, if the blues is like
Terrance, you're freezing a little bit.
one central aspect of it. Is that better?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, the blues as a form, one characteristic of it is it's unromantic. It's gonna tell you what it is and how it is. You know what I mean? And I think the blues that you are speaking in a certain way is that the church, the Black church especially, where all kinds of profound healing and transcendence for the deepest levels of violence and colonial thinking to get to. I mean, I think, the way to elucidate that in a movie is like, right? And even just this idea of like a word for spirit, like, a joint or a spirit house is like the place where Sammy goes is, especially at the end when he's like, oh, that was the best day of my life, before we were, bled. There's this explicit feeling that place was where the most violent, most brutal, depraved things happen, and also the most transcendent, most healing things happen, the most protected things happen. And I think it's just like a real thing. It's not so much the song that's being played, whether you telling the story of Elijah or you telling the story of or Amila or whoever. It's how you playing. You know what I mean? It's how connected you actually are and what you're connected to. And I think that's like a real both and. You know what I mean? Like which is central to just like African traditional religions. It's a both and. It's not either or. It's always a both and situation. And like I'm not gonna front. When I first saw that scene, I was kind of like, it didn't really hit for me. You know what I mean? I was like, I think my problem with it initially was the music. It felt like, we say this in film a lot, hat on a hat. I felt like initially it was like, what I thought was special about the blues is doing more with less.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's like, I was like, he could have just kept it rocking with the, Daddy, I had to lie to him. I love the blues and let that evolve, and it still would have contained the multitude. But that was my first watch, and I think that critique stayed in it because I love that problem in the movie because that scene is a central attempt in Black cinema history to visualize the unseen. And it's not ever gonna be first. These are hypotheses. We're trying shit. You know what I mean? And like, more about it is the attempts. I love the trauma, and I think that there's something about it wanting from it. It was like the constraint that's in the song. You know, like he has this moment where it's just like, like, I just repeat that I love it. You know, after my father, and I think that was my initial thing. And then I saw it again, and you know what I mean. I felt necessity. But one of my friends, Zora, also about like black melody or something like that. He was observing how black people, as an aesthetic proposition, have a thing and then put another thing on thing and then put another thing on top of that that they put on top of the thing. And that's like, you know.
Honestly, I felt the same way a little bit. And I mean, I love that scene, but while watching it, I could remember thinking, you can tell Ryan Coogler's from the West Coast. Because even in the first modern, he has the guitarist that looks like, it's like almost like a 70s kind of rock star, early 80s black rock star futurist. Then he goes into a turntable, but then he goes into breaking. All of it sounded like 90s West Coast timbre. And I was like, I heard that in Black Panther too. Like obviously he made Killmonger from Oakland, which in the comic books he's from New York. So they have Too Short playing when he first introduced him. And I'm like, I never thought I'd hear Too Short in a kids movie, but this guy is super California. And I felt like the sound of it, like you said, the sound of it became almost too modern for me. And it was too West Coast. Like if he had blended through the sounds of like the East Coast and the Midwest and the South and the West, I'd have been like, oh yeah, that's exactly what it needed to be. But I could hear the modernness in it, and I thought, but again, same thing. I've never seen anything like this before. So I'm critiquing something that doesn't exist because it's my own personal feeling, but I can't deny this is an amazing scene, right? And I heard the dancers didn't get credited, which I'm also a little bit pissed off of. But the way he also put the dancing in it, I thought was what took me back into it. Because I'm like, yeah, it sounds very West Coasty, it sounds very possibly, but he's got all the dancing that flips on the West Coast, the East Coast of Africa, into the Caribbean, into the modern. He had ballet. I was like, this is great. So I felt the same way, bro. Like it was like something about this just ain't, but it's good. And I also think we forget that Ryan Coogler is a
Yeah, I
young
mean,
filmmaker. You know,
good,
he's
good.
done 5 films. He got lucky. I mean, blessed, whatever. But he was an independent. Then he got the Black Panther and kind of. So he's been kind of thrusted into this sort of position of being a mainstream filmmaker, which I'm not sure if he even meant for that to happen. You know. But I'll
I
say
would say
So, was somebody getting ready to say
somebody
something?
was saying something.
he's he's in reform just as a human being, as a business strategist and a cultural strategist. I think where he planned to be in a very, you know, skilled. And, but I also think that like there's an to be said about like how many of us might be scandalized by what is or isn't there in that, you know, like Saul William called it the guitar solo in the movie. You know what I mean? I think that's also kind of why it's operating in culture. You know what I mean? Because it creates some sort of like contradiction and friction and interpretation because, you know, like that's the most blue shit ever is to sort of fight about who can play the chords right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and I think that that's all that's part of it. You know, like again, you know, just we need that. That's why everybody is on some level tuned in to hip hop for this long in a certain ways because it's retained that. It's retained that kind of like, man, get off the stage. Let me do this. Let me do my thing. You know what I mean? And I think that there's something black about that. You know what I mean? Like in the deployment of it. You know. But yeah, I think I do think that you know, there's a high level of, you know, ground to cover. It's just inspiring in terms of like what ground can we cover in terms of visualizing an ancestor in cinema. Like, what does
Mhm,
it look like actually? Like down
mhm.
to the technicality of like when an ancestor is there, given all the tools of cinema we have now in terms of making uh, images, in terms of making sounds, in terms of putting those together, in terms of editing, camera movement, it's light, all this stuff. How do you visualize and make into cinema what it feels like when your grandmama is right there over your shoulder and protecting you from something that could happen, but ain't happening, or even just celebrating with you? Or how do you do that? You know what I mean? And that's a amazing place to be actually be thinking about that across all of us making films. And there's another example. If everybody's seen the show Reservoir Dogs, I think in the third season, towards the end, there's an amazing scene where like they pray and then the ancestors, it's very minimal. If you watch this, Remy Weeks is a Black British filmmaker. He made a film called His House. It's on Netflix. It's a haunted house film about these ancestors that are in this house and how these immigrants from, I think, from Guinea-Bissau deal with it when they have to be amongst these paints in this house, so like he does a similar thing at the end of the movie. And we're in this question, like, and it's emerging. How do you do it? What can you do? And I would just end by saying, for me, it's the music. The failure of it is the music. Somehow, like, because when it worked, it's like he's singing that song at the beginning, you're with it. When he's singing a song with Stack in the car, you're with it. When Annie is talking and she's like, I prayed for you, and you hear this sort of sound of this other octave lower sound of her voice start to hit harder, like the goosebumps get pulled out, right? Because he's using this sonic first way of showing you that there are other forces there, right? So I think it's like, for us as Black people, we always know that that's the foundation of the answer, is the sound, like the music. And I think he even knew that in the movie. And it worked really, really well when that was happening,
Okay, I
I'm just
think.
gonna throw my 2 cents in real quick.
Go ahead.
As the person from California, born and raised, and I will agree that it sounded so Cali and it felt
Yes.
so home to me. And I am reminded that this movie does take place in a particular location in the Mississippi Delta, and it's calling on particular things. And I actually appreciate that Ryan Coogler wasn't trying to be all things for all people and trying to represent the totality of Blackness, because I think that when we do that, we end up diluting the fact that we're very regional. So how Hoodoo is practiced in Baltimore and Chesapeake is going to be very different than how it is in East Texas, and it's going to be very different than how it is in Mississippi, et cetera. And so I think there's some intentional, but I also agree that there are limitations that I think we do need to call to task. For example, I thought he had severe limitations in how he portrayed women and continued this trope of women as martyrs and women not as he attempted a little bit to show the full arc of being a woman, but at the end, Annie's liberation was only through death. Why? And I think it reminds us that as much as we want our storytellers to be our heroes, in a lot of ways they aren't. But what they do that's very unique is hold up mirrors and being able to put a stake in the ground at this time and in this place and in this region and in this way. And then we get to interpret the art and continue from this place and build on it and ask questions of it and continue to move, which is someone was asking in the comments around, why is this movie called Sinners? Is it about the tie that binds us? And I don't think that, because I think in order to think of it as, and I think the tagline is "We are all sinners," is to be approaching this idea of sin from a very Judeo-Christian perspective, that we're born sinners. And I don't believe that. That's not true to my practice. It's not true to my belief system that we're all sinners. But just like we saw Sammy's father in the beginning of put down that as evil. Is it evil? Are we sinners? Is this sin? Who is the sinner, if that is the case? And instead, what we believe in Hoodoo is that there's time and place, and nothing is absolute. Nothing is absolute. Not even death and murder is absolute in its wrongness and rightness, because everything depends on the context. Everything depends on the reason. Everything depends on, well, where are we? And I think that that's for me why the film was titled Sinners. What is that? What is a sin? What is a sinner? Who gets to decide? What power dynamics are at play in labeling others as such? What does that mean for ourselves when we see ourselves only as sinners? So there's not a clear answer, but I think, again, we're having a discourse about it.
Okay, well,
that's a
we're
great
coming up on our time.
Yeah, that's a great way to segue into the end. And to say that for those of you who are not familiar with the Denton Black Film Festival, I would encourage you to get familiar with them, because this is an entity in our area that brings all kinds of films to us by Black people. And they are always happy to have new audience members. So by all means, get to know about the Denton Black Film Festival. And then also I would encourage you to keep in touch with Miss Aleia MacDaniel so that you can gain some additional insights if you are so interested in the aspect of African spiritualism. And we would like to hear from you if you would put it in the chat. We were going to put some other topics up. Are those coming, Linda? We were going to put some other topics up to see if people were interested in having other similar conversations around some of the other topics that we were.
Right. We wanted to do a poll, and I think Sydney maybe has.
Are you going to put the poll up?
Yeah.
Okay. If you could quickly do the poll before we end, that would be great.
Because some of these were touched on, but there's room for more conversation.
There could be a topic about intersectionality. There was, Black, Irish, Chinese, Choctaw, all in this very Jim Crow-y kind of way and how they interacted. There's been a lot of discussions about, the way characters were presented and, especially in today's climate of, immigration, ICE, and, connectivity amongst cultures. I think that would be interesting if it could be not on there, but, if that's something we could discuss later.
Okay.
But yeah, go ahead.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for taking some time out on your Sunday to spend with us as we talk about this very important film. And I especially want to thank Terrance and Yaki and Patrick for being our thoughts on this subject, and a particular thank you for Aleia MacDaniel for bringing some true context to this conversation around spirituality. So there you go. Here's a way to contact people on the screen if you are so interested. And as I said, have a good Sunday.